Kingdom of Rust. The Kingdom of Rust is a scrapyard like no other I've visited in Scotland. It's packed full to the brim with ageing relics left to slowly rust away. Most scrapyards today have a high turnover of stock. Cars come in, valuable parts removed, and then off to the crusher. Some cars don't even make it into the breaker's yard and are sent to be crushed right away. This place is something else. Imagine a yard that never crushed anything since it started taking in cars in the late 60s. The place is owned by Leslie Fairfield, a farmer in his 80s. He said he started the scrapyard as a young farmer when between farming jobs he would go to farm sales and pick up scrap machinery and equipment. In the late 60s, the garage in the nearest town of New Deer needed rid of scrap cars and Leslie took them in for free.
If you're working in other people's time, it didn't fit in well with breeding cows and that. So you sort of needed to be with just when they needed you.
Yeah.
So I went on to sort of buying scrap metal at farm sales and dealing in sort of low-cost machinery, which I could more or less, apart from the day of a sale, I could do it in my own time. And it's sort of bought in place, and the shop in the garage in New Deer was wanting rid of a heap of scrap cars. So he carted them over here, and I got the rates off Old House and got it down to an agricultural store. But when the rates chap came to check it out, he said, "Oh, you have a scrapyard," and we didn't have a scrapyard. Which in the tail end of the day was a good thing, because when it came on to scrapyard licensing, mine was an established business.
Yeah.
You know, and no planning restrictions. But then something that you'll need to remember, the local CP people are quite good. They're waiting for me to die. They're not descended on me for all this stuff out with the yard. That's a good point somewhere. And you meet a lot of interesting people in this, you know. Kind of people who are interested in old vehicles and antique implements and are mostly interested, you know.
How long have you been doing this?
Well, I just bought in place in 1971, so you had to go back before that. Late 60s.
Aye.
Late 60s. But then, I'm an inefficient farmer, an inefficient scrap merchant, but I'm still in business. Story of my life was turning a small overdraft into a big one, and then getting turned down to a small one again. See, write it off like that.
Cars continued to be left there by the locals up until the noughties, when scrap prices began to rise and scrapyards were paying the car owners for their cars. Back in the day, you had to pay for scrap cars to be taken away. The cars in the yard vary between 60s to 90s cars. The bottom field has cars such as a pair of Volvo 245s, Austin Allegros, Chevettes, Old Rovers, Humbers, Datsuns, Cortinas, all that kind of stuff. Most are melting into the ground, but some parts are still salvageable, even today, if you know what you're looking for. My last visit to the yard was for a friend to remove parts from a left-hand drive W123 Mercedes estate. He completely stripped the interior and the dash. A left-hand drive dash probably isn't worth much in the UK, but in his native Hungary, an uncracked Mercedes dash is worth taking home to sell. Another friend from down south, Andrew Eve, who's well known as an avid collector of classic Datsuns, had been in touch and asked if I would be able to remove a dashboard and steering box from an old Datsun. He had seen photos of it that I'd taken on previous visits. The Datsun was rotting into the ground and needed very little effort to liberate the dash and steering column, which I ripped out with my bare hands. I grabbed hold of the steering wheel and yanked it through the side of the A-pillar, taking the column and box with it, and it still had the struts and wheels attached to it via the arms and track rod ends. As it was a typical Scottish summer, the rain had been pissing down for a while and I was drenched, so I fucked off to find shelter inside the least mouldiest car I could find. As the rain started to die off, I went back to the Datsun. The bolt on the steering box, which was holding the strut to it, was very rusty. I didn't really have access to power, and the battery grinder I'd brought with me had died after we'd used it to cut a timing chain off the Mercedes. With the help of the owner, Leslie, he used a technique I'd never seen before for nut removal, which was to batter fuck out of it with a hammer and chisel until it fell to pieces.
For a change.
A few minutes later, the nut was removed from the steering box without causing any damage to the threads. I loaded the parts onto Leslie's tractor and he took them away along to the Mercedes that was being stripped. The entrance to the yard is access through the centre of a working farm. Parking anywhere around the farm is forbidden. There's a rutty track along the side of the field which takes you into the place. This is where I usually leave my car. The track widens at the corner of the field and it's possible to undertake a 20 billion point turn to get the car back out. From that corner of the field there's a much heavier rutty track which is probably half a mile long and can only be accessed on foot or by tractor. I think a lot of 4x4s would get beached in the ruts. It feels like miles on foot, especially when loaded up with heavy tools or awkward shaped car parts, so we usually ask Leslie if he can take the parts up with his tractor, which is a great help. Most of the cars in the yard are beyond saving or going back on the road, and because the road into the place is so heavily rutted, it would take quite a lot of effort to remove them. Leslie did say he would entertain selling complete cars, but the cost in removing them probably wouldn't be financially viable for most people. I know a lot of people can become quite upset at the sight of old cars which have been left to rot, but what you've got to remember is back when those cars entered the yard, they were worthless heaps of shite. Most other places, they would have been crushed a long time ago. After Leslie had transported our parts to the cars, we made bids on the parts we'd accumulated. His prices are always cheap or fair, and he's always happy with the money we give him. He doesn't mind if you're buying the parts to sell on, as long as you're handing over some crisp 20s at the end of the day. I think I paid around £50 for my bits, and the next week Andrew visited from the south of England and paid a very generous £300 for the parts he needed. I also gave him some other stuff I had lying around, including a roof rack to hold all his tat into his car.